Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending upon what time of day it is. This is another flipped video lesson. We are getting into now chapter 5, starting with 5.1 videos A and B. Chapter 5 is a very interesting chapter because we start getting into and looking into how Washington State went from being a land full of settlers and farmers into becoming more of an industrialized state. First off, we need to talk about two pretty big events that occurred in the history of our country. First off, the United States won the Mexican War. Because of that, we got land right here, which is a lot of Mexico today, and a lot of land right here, which is a lot of California, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada. You add this with the fact that gold was found in California, and there was this huge push to have a transcontinental railroad connect the eastern part of the country to the western part of the country. With this thought in mind, Congress put forth the Pacific Railroad Survey Bill. They were going to look at 5 different routes to get from the Mississippi River out to the West Coast. Now, Isaac Stevens, who would become our first territorial governor, led the Northern Route group. He surveyed 2,000 miles in about 2 months. He actually was working with 12 Army men, and there was a lot of worry that these Army men would not be able to take orders from someone who was not in the military. However, Isaac Stevens worked his group like military type work, and because of that, the men that he worked with had a lot of respect for Isaac Stevens. He actually split his one big group into 2 separate groups. One group would start from the Puget Sound, and they would work their way east. Another group would start from the Mississippi River, and they'd work their way to the west, and then they'd meet somewhere in the middle in the Cascade Mountains. Now, Isaac Stevens felt that the Northern Route had the best chance to get goods to Asia, and because of that, he worked really hard and had very detailed notes that he sent to the Secretary of War, whose name was Davis, who had sent everyone off to find these new railroad routes. He felt that Asia could be a very important trade partner with Washington Territory. And Stevens was looking at railroad lines going to Seattle, Steilacoom, and Bellingham Bay. Those are areas where he felt then they could ship things from those bay areas to Asia. However, Secretary of War Davis was against the more northern routes. He wanted a route that was more focused in the south because he himself was from the southern states. So even though Isaac Stevens put a lot of work and effort into surveying a northern route, he was pretty much shot down by Davis. Now this map here shows the 5 different routes through the country, and I'd like you to pause the video for a second and just take a look at all these routes. Look closely at what states they go through, and which one, in your opinion, do you think would be the best route? And in fact, I would like you to shout out loud so people can hear you which route you think is the best. So unfortunately, Isaac Stevens did not get that first transcontinental railroad to go through Washington Territory. However, in the end, Washington State ended up joining the Transcontinental Railroad in 1883. It would go from the Great Lakes all the way to Puget Sound. And the Northern Pacific Railroad would be the railroad that would do it. As we can see the symbol right here of that railroad, Pacific Railroad would end up becoming a very important corporation in our state. First off, because they influenced the settlement of people coming over to Washington State. Also, they influenced the economic development because railroads connected businesses to each other. A railroad was a way to get shipments from point A to point B quickly, as opposed to doing it from horse-drawn carriage. Now, a little bit about the background of the Northern Pacific Railroad. First off, they were chartered by Congress. So Congress gave them a piece of paper that said, you're in business, we want you to do this railroad. Also, they were given huge land grants from Congress to build the railroad. These land grants are important because the government sold land to the companies so they could build their tracks on. The land belonged to the government, not to the railroad, so the companies had to buy it. The track would end up going from St. Paul, Minnesota, all the way to Tacoma, Washington. Notice I said Tacoma, Washington, not Seattle, Washington. Real quick, how do you think the people in Seattle felt about the fact that the first transcontinental railroad didn't go to Seattle, but went to Tacoma? Interesting. So, talking now about a little bit about the economics of the railroad. Why was it so important? Well, first off, the railroad built and expanded towns that suited their needs. If you had a railroad go by your town, hey, good business for you. If the railroad didn't go to your town and went to a different town instead, you would soon shrivel up and you'd be gone. And we can talk about that more in class. Also, the railroads ended up being the biggest promoter of the Pacific Northwest. The more people that came to the Northwest, the more people were going to use their railroad. So they would charge fares for settlers to come over. They then would sell land to these settlers. Remember, the railroads were getting land grants. Now, you can't put a railroad that takes up all the land. The railroad just goes on part of your land. So the land that isn't used for tracks would be sold to settlers. Also, as I mentioned earlier, the railroads would ship produce and natural resources back east. So there's lots of ways that these railroads are getting money from the people moving out to Washington State. Coal mines also got a huge help from railroads because railroads would use the coal to power the railroads. Not the railroads, but the trains themselves. Also, the railroads were used as a distribution network. It would move goods and ideas across the country. Great way to quickly move an idea over here to here, and a railroad would link the idea from here over to here, and another railroad would link the idea over to here. So you'd have the same idea being moved throughout the country. Pause the video for a second, please, and I'd like you to read through this advertisement. And I want you to think about some of the things that pop out and stand out to you. The railroads also had a huge impact on the lumber industry because it generated a big desire for lumber. Think about this. The railroad obviously needed lumber. Washington went from being the 31st producer of lumber in 1880 to becoming the 5th largest producer of lumber in 1890. So in 10 years, they jumped up like 30 spots almost in terms of how much lumber it was producing. The railroads allowed loggers to go deeper into forests. Because of the tracks, they could go places they could never go before. They also, railroad back to, and then the fact that railroads needed logs, is they needed the lumber for bridges. The actual tracks were made out of lumber, also for fuel. The railroad also brought machines and workers to the Pacific Northwest. Finally, the railroads lowered the cost of transporting logs because it was quicker and easier to move logs on the railroad as opposed to doing it by horses pulling it. Now, we can't talk about railroads without talking about, first off, how they get the money to build them and how they get the money to get the land. We've already touched a little bit about the land. First off, the government owned all the land out west. So they didn't just give the land to the railroads because, well, let's face it, that's bad business. They ended up selling the land to the railroads. And as we talked about, the railroads would then sell the land that they didn't use for tracks to settlers to help pay the costs. If you take a look at this map here, this is the land that was sold as land grants to railroads. So it's really interesting looking at the land and where it went and how it cut through all these states. The railroads end up becoming the largest private landowners of land out west. So they had a big influence on not only who got land in the Pacific Northwest, but also how the land was used. These railroad companies were also given land based on how much track was laid and on the geography of the land. So if you laid more track, you got more money. If your track went up really steep inclines, you got more money. So think about that. If you got money based on how much track you laid and on the type of geography where you laid the track, would you rather lay tracks along plains, the flat land, in a really quick route? Or would you rather go through the steepest part of the mountains? It's an interesting thought. Finally, another way that companies got money was through private investors. A gentleman, who you will read about more in the textbook, by the name of Henry Villard, got European investors to help pay for the Northern Pacific Railroad, which, as a railroad, we've talked about already. The railroad companies have the land and the money to build the tracks. There was a huge demand for workers to help put everything together. As a result, the government encouraged European and Asian immigration to help fill this need for workers. As a result of this, Chinese and Irish workers, who were the main immigrants used, were paid very small amounts because they're more easily hired than American workers. Chinese and Irish workers also were given the most dangerous jobs. And again, we'll read more about this in the coming chapters. Well, thank you for watching this flip video. Please go to Edmodo to answer the homework questions.